We're starting with the Dallas Cowboys. We're going to try to give everybody some key players, key storylines, best and the worst case scenario. What are we looking for this season? So let's start with the Cowboys. Biggest thing coming off of 2023, 12-5. They won the NFC East. Then they lose. First round in the playoffs, divisional round in the playoffs. What are you looking for this year with the Cowboys?
Yeah, and obviously Dallas's offseason, it's been this kind of drama of, they come up short yet again in the postseason. Jerry Jones makes a big deal out of, let's go again, right? This group, 12 wins, 3 straight years rather. We're really close. We're knocking on the door. It's the last year of everybody's contract. Coach Mike McCarthy's on the last year of his deal. Dak's in the last year of his deal. Cee Dee Lamb, the last year of his deal. Micah Parsons' contract coming up. And then Jerry Jones does the whole, I'm all in this next year. Only there's no evidence of that based off the personnel moves. It's been trying to retain some of their own players or letting guys walk and then replacing them with draft picks. And really, it looks like it's going to be an achievement if this team is just able to maintain where they were last year in terms of being a 12-win football team. And even that much is going to be relying on them continuing this streak of drafting really well because of how much they're going to be relying on guys like offensive tackle Tyler Guyton, a rookie. So, yeah, Dallas is still a very good football team. Drama everywhere. Nobody's under contract. Nobody's significant. And so much is now reliant on these rookies. It's a really fascinating situation, which ultimately is how Jerry Jones likes it.
It's funny because if Jerry Jones wasn't creating all the drama, you could say, hey, the Cowboys have a style of team building that is actually pretty impressive. Now, look, there's some contract stuff that if the goal is to just win the Super Bowl, letting Dak get to the final hour and CD and Micah Parsons, waiting on those guys isn't maybe the best move. Signing Zeke a few years ago, maybe not the best move. But we always preach building through the draft, and as you touched on, their draft has been spectacular. If you look at the last 5 or 6 years, arguably the best drafting team in the NFL, which is why they have this headache of trying to figure out Cee Dee Lamb, Micah Parsons, and of course Dak, and fitting them all under the cap going forward. So I would just say Dallas, no matter what they've done the last couple of years, they've sprinkled in necessary veterans. They've kind of rolled the dice on younger players at times. It has worked, right? They've gotten to this 11, 12 win mark, been a very good team. But how do we solve this problem of when you get into the playoffs, you have to win it? And every year it seems like, well, we need to stop the run better. We need a nose tackle. We need to run the ball better. We need the running back. I don't know if there's a specific answer for the Cowboys this year other than, hey, you're still a really good team. You just got to show up in the playoffs, in crunch time.
Yeah, they do. Last season was concerning because, in particular, that was what felt like a real a choke, right? Honestly, that's what it was. Dallas last year rolled into the postseason as a very good football team, and you wouldn't have known it from the playoff game. Like, that was the thing. It was a completely different side once that game started. Dak Prescott and Cee Dee Lamb, arguably the most potent combination in the NFL last season, or certainly second after Tua to Tyreek Hill. They looked like they'd never played together before. They weren't on the same page. They couldn't connect. One guy was always doing something different to the other, what the other was expecting. And Dallas simply did not show up. It was like the weight of those 20 years of history was oppressively weighing down on everybody's shoulders. And that's concerning because that's only going to increase year on year. Every year they come up short is adding another year of weight to that historical failure that they're now battling against, in addition to just trying to beat the opponent in front of you. So that was concerning for Dallas, is that that became a major problem, and that's not going to change. So this group that they've assembled, Dak Prescott, Cee Dee Lamb, Micah Parsons, all the talent that they have on the roster, those guys need to play even better this season to get over that hump that's only getting harder to achieve.
Normally, I like to pride ourselves, Sam, on providing solutions for teams here on Check the Mic. If you just make this move, or you just add this player, or draft this position, or whatever it might be. I don't have great answers for Dallas, though, because again, I think they're going to be good again. So let's get into best and worst case scenario, because for me, the best case scenario is, well, the young players need to step up. We'll talk about key positions, and I don't think there's a more important draft pick, especially in the first round, than Tyler Guyton, the left tackle, the guy that's been trusted to take over for Tyron Smith at left tackle. A best case scenario is that Tyler Guyton improves greatly from college, and the early returns in the preseason are that is possible, that Tyler Guyton is going to look pretty good even as a rookie. So what is the best case scenario for Dallas? Some of these young players that they've trusted take that next step, and that they, do well with their trust, and that Dak does turn it on in the playoffs, that they do figure it out in the playoffs. I don't know what that special secret button is. I don't know that it's running the ball more, but I think they're built in the right way on both sides of the ball. They should have a good offensive line. They've got playmakers to throw to. They can rush the passer, and they're unbelievable in the secondary, especially with Trayvon Diggs coming back off of injury.
Yeah, the best case scenario for them is that they get this playoff monkey off their back. Remember the way Steve Young was battling that for years, right? Trying to get the Super Bowl monkey off his back. Finally got it done. And it's all right, Steve Young's now a Hall of Famer. He's now an all-time great. Dallas has to get the playoff monkey off their back, but I'm not sure what that is. What actually achieves that? Because they've won playoff games. It's just they always then fail again, right? So winning a playoff game doesn't necessarily get the playoff monkey off their back. Does getting to the NFC Championship get the monkey off their back? Because I sort of feel like once you push beyond that failure, once they finally get over that hump and aren't, they kind of release themselves, they get out from under that weight, and they can now be a much more successful team. But I don't know how many wins is going to require for that to actually happen.
Yeah.
If they win a wild card game, does it happen?
No.
Do they need to win a division game? Do they need to win the NFC Championship game? How many wins do they need before they're sort of liberated and free again?
I mean, they won a wild card game a couple years ago. This isn't every single time they've stepped on a playoff field.
Right.
They've been terrible. They were the winners in Tom Brady's final game against the Bucs, and Dak was outstanding in that game. They overcame 5 missed extra points in that game to still win. So it's not just one playoff game. It needs to be conference championship or better. And maybe even a Lions-like conference championship game where they kind of blow it, and it's well, you could have been in the Super Bowl. You could have been there, I mean, that feels like progress, at least. The worst case scenario, though, is dire, isn't it? I mean, you're looking at a team that either does the same thing previously, wins 12 games, loses first round in the division game against a team that's just younger, hotter, whatever it is, like the Packers last year, or you add in the fact that it's Dak's last year, and you might blow this whole thing up. Mike McCarthy's final year of his contract as well. We're talking final year of contract for Dak, Mike McCarthy, Cee Dee Lamb, Micah Parsons coming due. The worst case scenario is some of these guys just don't even want to come back to the Cowboys as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's the worst case scenario for 2024, and then there's the worst case scenario for the franchise as a whole. The worst case scenario for the franchise as a whole is they somehow don't actually manage to get the Dak Prescott deal done, and now they have to go back to the quarterback well from somewhere. And whether or not they win 12 games again, we assume that this Dallas team is going to be way too good to put themselves in position to get another quarterback. So not getting a Dak contract done is a genuine worst-case scenario for the whole team, which is why eventually we assume he's going to get a deal. He's going to get $60 million a year, whatever that looks like, because they need him. They can't not let that happen. The worst-case scenario in 2024 feels like it should still be fairly good, right? The worst case scenario is Tyler Guyton is still inconsistent, doesn't really nail down a left tackle job, certainly can't replace what Tyron Smith was. He's inconsistent. He's something of a liability at left tackle. Same thing maybe with Cooper Beebe at center. Maybe they don't have this answer at center. Now 2/5 of the offensive line is problematic. They, have a relative lack of depth in some other places, and they're simply not particularly good. But that's still a 7-8 win team.
One of the biggest storylines this offseason, defensive coordinator Dan Quinn moving on from Dallas to division rival Washington Commanders, take over the head coaching job. They bring Mike Zimmer in back to Dallas to coach the defense. One of the things that Quinn was able to do, and this is why analyzing the Cowboys is really difficult, Sam, they kind of break some of the trends, right? The trend would be me telling you who cares if they keep choking in the playoffs? At some point you just keep getting on the green and you'll hit one of those putts. Well, they keep missing the putts. And then the other part would be you can't rely on turnovers. You can't rely on takeaways on the defense, right? That always regresses, and every coach preaches turnovers and takeaways, but somebody's got to be last. But Dallas was always unbelievable at turning the ball over under Dan Quinn, especially picking passes off, creating havoc, rushing the passer. Will that regress finally with Dan Quinn moving on? How will Mike Zimmer fit in as the coordinator of this defense?
I feel like that's going to end up kind of coming out in the wash. It'll be a different defense. Obviously, maybe somebody like Micah Parsons is going to have a different role within this defense and won't simply be an every down pass rusher, and instead will be deployed more like, Von Miller earlier in his career, where he was kind of playing that Sam linebacker who would drop down and rush the passer and sub packages. Like, maybe the specifics will be different, but Mike Zimmer, even late in his time with the Vikings, that defense still had teeth. It was still able to perform, particularly on third downs. Maybe the turnovers will regress a little bit. They won't be able to rely on those as much, but maybe the overall down-to-down efficiency of the defense will be a little bit better. So I sort of feel like that Dan Quinn to Mike Zimmer thing is going to end up being a wash, even if it'll be a very different type of defense.
All right, let's get to key players, and whether it's a player or a position group, want to highlight one for every single team during the series. You already mentioned the guy for me, Tyler Guyton, so I guess I'll just kick it off. And I said most important draft pick because he's got to play left tackle. And if there's been one thing that's been really consistent for Dallas, it's been their offensive line. And even when they had a little bit of turnover over the last few years, they were very effective in pass protection. They were solid run blockers. I think their run game inconsistency had more to do with their running backs over the last couple of years than anything else. It's been a really good offensive line, but you're talking turnover at center with Tyler Biadasz now moving on to Washington, and at left tackle with Tyron Smith moving on. Still pretty solid there. Zach Martin at right guard, Terrence Steele coming off a rough season, coming off of injury, but if he gets back to where he was before, Tyler Smith at left guard, they're mostly good, but there's a lot of pressure on Tyler Guyton at left tackle. And again, he was a project coming out of Oklahoma. His best plays look great. His bad plays look terrible. There was an even mix of both. So there's a lot of pressure on him starting left tackle, taking over for Tyron Smith.
Yeah, I mean, Tyler Guyton, I think, is the single most important one. But I honestly think their first three draft picks are all critical. Dallas put themselves in a position where all three of those guys might need to contribute and might need to be significant players to them. So Tyler Guyton, their first-round tackle out of Oklahoma, we expect him to be their starting left tackle. Marshawn Kneeland, the defensive lineman out of Western Michigan. They lost some defensive linemen in free agency. They've had injuries to others. Obviously, Micah Parsons is fantastic, but that depth has been really tested. They probably need Marshawn Kneeland to make an impact year one. Otherwise, they're going to have depth problems along that defensive line. And then Cooper Beebe, who we've already mentioned, the presumably starting center out of Kansas State, or at least a guy that could absolutely win that center job. All three of those guys might need to be at least average NFL players just to stay where they were a year ago.
All right, the one last story I want to keep an eye out on is the receiver situation. Remember when Cee Dee Lamb was drafted? They'd already had Amari Cooper, and they had Michael Gallup, who already looked like one of the better number twos in the NFL. And you know me, Sam. Love that. Draft the non-need position, high-impact player, and that's paying off for Dallas because Cee Dee Lamb obviously surpassed both of those guys, Amari Cooper and Michael Gallup, as players. He's the only one left. The number two receiver spot, though, Brandon Cooks, I thought he would be crucial last year. It kind of took him about half a season to really get going. There's some risk there. He's in his 30s. If he regresses a little bit, I'm thinking wide receiver 2-3 for Dallas is going to be a key spot. Brandon Cooks kind of being the consistent player he's been for the majority of his career, and then the number 3 spot. All the guys named Jalen going out for that spot. Jalen Tolbert maybe in the lead to be that guy. Dak's production has always kind of coincided with the level of depth at their receiver position. So I think that's the other piece to keep an eye on, as well as the offensive line.
It's also worth throwing out there that as much as the run game is not necessarily determined by how good your backfield is, that's a rough-looking backfield now. They've got the reclaimed version of Zeke Elliott, who looks spent at this point. Rico Dowdle, Royce Freeman was signed. Like, this is not a strong-looking group. So the more important part might actually be the rookies that we've already mentioned, like how the offensive line actually fares. But this is not an offense, you think, by looking at it, that's going to be able to lean on their talented running backs and, generate production that way. That might be a problem for them.
All right, so I think what we'll do is we'll tie it all together at the end of the show with predictions. We'll tie it all together with our division order, so we won't make a prediction right off the bat with Dallas, but I'll sum it up like this. With some of those holes that we mentioned, especially on the offensive side of the ball, it feels like the guy that wants $60 million a year, Dak Prescott, there's a little more pressure on him this year. Not from a, really need to win standpoint, but just they haven't done much with the supporting cast. They haven't fixed the run game. They've added more question marks on the offensive line, some youth, and I don't know if they've stocked up at receiver in a way that's, improving over the last couple of years. So we always talk about from a team-building standpoint, when you pay the quarterback, it's harder to put those pieces around. That's what this team-building effort feels like for Dallas right now. So a little bit more pressure on Dak, who, by the way, is coming off his best statistical season, but his best stats were way better against the worst teams. And he wasn't able to do it against the better teams. So see if he could do it this year.
And has tended, generally in his career as well, to be a little bit volatile and sort of tied to the supporting cast around him. When Amari Cooper was first traded away, Dak Prescott immediately suffered. So maybe he's outgrown that, or maybe simply Cee Dee Lamb is so good that he's kind of insulated from it a bit. But again, if they have chipped away at the offensive line a little bit, if they have made the backfield worse, if they have lost depth at wide receiver because, Brandon Cooks has gotten older and it is just Cee Dee Lamb now, Dak Prescott's job kind of got incrementally harder every step of the way.